The first thing Callum Dre noticed was the light. It came through the curtains in thin, blue-white blades, the particular quality of light that only exists after a heavy snowfall, when the whole world outside has gone silent and pale and the usual noise of the city has been swallowed whole. He'd grown up in Ohio. He knew that light. It meant at least 6 inches had fallen overnight. Maybe more. The second thing he noticed was the pain. It lived behind his eyes and radiated outward with each heartbeat, dull and relentless. The kind of headache that announces itself before you're even fully conscious. Before you know your name, before you remember the year, before any of the ordinary scaffolding of your life reassembles itself. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the world to come back to him in pieces the way it always did on mornings like this. His ceiling, his bedroom. The familiar water stain in the corner shaped like Michigan. Okay, he was home. He didn't remember getting home. He shifted carefully, testing the soreness in his shoulders. He'd been pushing steel framing for 12 hours in 20-degree wind. And his body had the full invoice. The mattress shifted. He went very still. There was weight on the other side of the bed. Not the restless presence of a child climbing in at 3 in the morning. He knew that weight. Knew how Wren moved in her sleep. Knew the particular way she'd curl against his side. This was different. This was the still, self-contained weight of another adult. And there was a warmth radiating from that side of the mattress that his body registered before his mind could form a coherent thought about it. He turned his head slowly. A woman lay beside him, her back half turned toward him, her dark hair spread across the pillow in a way that his tired brain registered as, and he hated himself for thinking this before anything else, genuinely beautiful. She was wearing his shirt, his flannel shirt, the gray one with the frayed left cuff, which had been hanging on the bathroom door when he'd last seen it. On him it came to mid-thigh. On her it was just slightly shorter than that. Her shoes, black heels, the kind designed more for a conference room than a construction site neighborhood bar, were placed neatly side by side at the foot of the bed. That detail, more than anything else, made his stomach tighten, because the neatness of it suggested agency. It suggested she had stood in his bedroom at some point, removed her shoes, and placed them precisely parallel, and he had been present for none of it. He closed his eyes, tried to reconstruct, last night, the job site, the final walkthrough on the Meridian Tower framing contract, the one they'd been grinding through since October. Darnell passing around a flask in the equipment shed at 5 o'clock. Someone saying we need to actually celebrate, man. A bar, warm and amber lit, somewhere on Claiborne Street. Then gaps, not darkness, exactly. More like a film reel with frames missing conversation. Laughter. The bass from the speakers. Someone's hand on his arm. Then, nothing. Then, this. She stirred. Callum had exactly 2 seconds to decide what his face would do. And he spent both of them failing. By the time she rolled over, his expression was somewhere between confused and alarmed, and not adequately either. She looked at him with eyes that were fully awake, dark brown, steady, not a trace of the bleary disorientation he felt written all over his own face. She looked at him the way a person looks at a situation they had already prepared for. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried. "I'm awake," he agreed, because it seemed like the safest response. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "You're stronger than I expected." He processed that. He could not think of a single context in which that sentence was reassuring. "I'm sorry? Carrying you up the stairs." A small pause. "You're a large man." Something in Callum's chest unknotted very slightly. He was not sure it deserved to. She pushed herself upright, adjusting the collar of his shirt with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in their own skin regardless of circumstances. She looked around his bedroom, with what appeared to be mild, professional interest. The framed photo of Wren on the nightstand, the stack of overdue library books, the work boots by the door. "What time is it?" he asked. 6:42. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, his nightstand, where she had apparently placed it the night before, and confirmed this. "Your daughter is still asleep. I heard her around 4, but she settled on her own. He stared at her. You know I have a daughter. You told me about her for approximately 40 minutes last night. The corners of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled than that. Her name is Wren. She's 6. She has an imaginary horse named Chancellor. Callum put his face in both hands. The name came to him before she said it. He didn't know from where a business card he'd seen at the site office once. A name in a company email, something peripheral, but it arrived fully formed and settled into him with the specific weight of information that is both important and terrible. You're Sable Merritt, he said, through his hands. A beat of silence. Yes, she said, I am. He lowered his hands and looked at her. She was watching him with that same steadiness. And he couldn't tell if she was waiting for him to panic, or simply observing how he chose not to. She was the CEO of Hartwell Development Group. His employer, the person who had signed the contract that had kept 23 men employed through the worst winter in recent memory. Nothing happened, she said. The directness of it was startling. To be clear, you were in no condition for anything to happen, and I'm not in the habit of creating situations I'd prefer not to be in. You needed to get home. Your friend Darnell, he had his truck, but he'd been drinking too. I had a car. This was the logical outcome. He nodded. He tried to organize his thoughts into something resembling competence, and found the project challenging. Okay, he said. She tilted her head slightly. Okay, thank you, he added. She stood, moved to the foot of the bed, and stepped into her heels with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 20 years. Her composure was either admirable or unsettling. Possibly both. There's no reason this needs to be complicated, she said, pulling her jacket, which had been folded over the chair he used as a secondary clothes rack, from its resting place. We had a conversation. I made a practical decision, that's all. He opened his mouth to say something, and was saved by the small, firm knock on his bedroom door. Dad? Wren's voice, just slightly plaintive. Dad, it snowed. Can we look? Callum exhaled. Give me 1 minute, Bug. He looked at Sable. She looked at him, and for just a moment, 1 second, maybe 2, something crossed her face that wasn't composure, wasn't professionalism, wasn't the controlled efficiency she'd wrapped herself in since the moment she'd opened her eyes. It was something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. Then it was gone. I'll see myself out, she said. The Meridian Tower framing had been done since 2:30 in the afternoon, but the final walkthrough took until well past 5, because Marcus Fletcher, the site project manager, had wanted every third anchor bolt individually documented, and Callum was not the kind of foreman to argue with documentation. By the time the last man punched out, the wind off the river had dropped to about 12 degrees of felt temperature, and the sky had the flat, yellow-gray color that meant snow was coming in volume. We're going to Laney's, Darnell Okafor announced, already halfway to his truck. Darnell had been Callum's second on every project for 4 years, and operated at all times, as though he'd already decided what was happening next, and was merely informing you. Don't give me the speech about Wren. Mrs. Figueroa texted me that she's got her until 9. You texted my neighbor? I planned ahead. Darnell pulled his hat down over his ears. Come on, man. We finished a $9 million contract on time, in the middle of the worst winter since 2008. We're drinking. Laney's bar was on Claiborne Street, wedged between a dry cleaner and a parking garage in a neighborhood that was half industrial, half trying to gentrify, and currently losing the argument. From the outside it was nothing. A green awning, 2 small windows fogged with warmth. Inside, it was the most honest kind of bar. Dim, warm, full of people who worked with their hands and wanted an hour of not thinking about it. They took the far end of the bar, ordered the cheap whiskey, and toasted a contract that had cost them 4 months of cold mornings and had required Callum to solve, without complaint or explanation, approximately 200 small engineering problems that had not been in the original scope. He was on his second drink when he noticed her. Not because she was out of place. Exactly, the bar had been filling up, and she'd come in with her coat still dusted with snow, settled onto a stool 3 seats down, and ordered something he couldn't identify. She was somewhere in her late 30s, he guessed, though she carried herself in a way that made age feel beside the point. There was a focused stillness about her, the kind that comes not from passivity but from very deliberate self-containment, like someone who had learned to take up exactly the space they needed, and no more. He hadn't intended to speak to her. He was pleasantly warm, loosening at the shoulders, content to let the evening be what it was. But she was reading something, an actual printed report, he noticed. The kind with tabs and highlighter marks at a bar at 7 on a Wednesday in January. And that detail charmed him despite himself. Heavy reading for a Wednesday, he said. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and direct. She held his gaze for a beat, longer than most people would, as though assessing whether he was worth answering. Heavy week, she said. That was the beginning of it. He didn't give her his name. She didn't offer hers. That was the thing about it. It happened naturally, the absence of names, as if they'd silently agreed that names came with luggage and they both needed an hour of traveling light. He bought her a drink. She bought the next round. Darnell looked over once, registered what was happening with the precision of a man who had known Callum for 4 years, and quietly migrated to the other end of the bar to give him room. She asked him what he did. Construction, he said. Structural framing, mostly. Big buildings. He paused. What about you? I run a company, she said. And then, before he could ask which one, what's a big building feel like? From the inside of building it? It was such a specific question. Not the usual, oh, interesting. Must be hard work, but a genuine reaching toward something. He looked at her for a moment, and then he answered, honestly. He told her about the particular satisfaction of standing inside a steel skeleton you'd had a hand in raising. When the wind was coming through and the whole structure was groaning faintly with it, and you could feel in the soles of your feet that the thing was going to hold. He told her about the math of load distribution, which had been the first thing about the job that had genuinely interested him, the way physics became physical. Became something you could touch. She listened with complete attention. Not the polite attention of someone waiting for their turn. Real attention. The kind that makes you aware you're being heard. He told her about Ren somewhere around the 3rd drink. He hadn't planned to. She'd asked, "What's keeping you in a city this cold?" And it had come out before he could redirect it. Ren was 6. Ren had brown eyes and her mother's laugh, and a ferocity of opinion about her stuffed animals that had once reduced Callum to helpless laughter for a full 5 minutes. Ren had an imaginary horse named Chancellor that she'd been riding since she was 4. Her mother had died 18 months ago. Breast cancer. Fast. And uncompromising. He said it plainly, because that was the only way he'd found to say it without it becoming something that consumed the whole room. Just a fact. Just the truest thing about the current shape of his life. Sable, though he didn't know her name yet, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's lucky. To have someone who talks about her the way you do." It was not the sympathetic pivot he'd expected. It was not, "I'm so sorry, that must be so hard." It was this instead, which landed somewhere lower and more permanent. By the time the snow started in earnest, visible through the foggy window, coming down in the thick, windless way that meant it meant business, he had had 3 drinks too many for a cold Thursday morning, and she was the one who said, "You're not getting home in that condition. Let me help." And he was not in the position to argue. He didn't remember the rest. But he'd talked about Ren for 40 minutes, and she'd listened to every word. By the time Ren had seen the snow approximately 6 inches, as he'd predicted, blanketing the narrow street and the parked cars, and the neighbor's sad ornamental tree with a thick silence, that she received as pure joy, and had eaten 2 toaster waffles, and had explained to Callum in exhaustive detail her vision for a snow fort that would incorporate, and this was non-negotiable, a horse stable for Chancellor. He had felt enough like himself to think clearly about what had happened. He'd made her the waffles on autopilot, the way he made them every Saturday, standing at the narrow counter with one hand on the toaster and one wrapped around his coffee, watching her at the table in her flannel pajamas and the oversized fleece socks. She refused to give up despite having grown 2 inches since they'd been purchased. She was 6 years old, and she had opinions that ran ahead of her experience, like a scout sent into territory not yet mapped. And he loved her with the particular density of a person who has loved someone in the presence of loss and knows what that weight actually is. She didn't ask again about the woman. She'd gotten what she needed from the exchange and moved on with the pragmatic efficiency of a child whose interior life was adequately occupied. Chancellor's stable wasn't going to design itself. The apartment was quiet after Wren settled with her crayons at the kitchen table. Callum stood at the counter, coffee in hand, and turned the morning over in his mind. She had not said anything that wasn't true. Nothing had happened. She had made a practical decision. There was no reason for it to be complicated. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it wasn't. What he felt, if he was honest, was not embarrassment or alarm or the tight, coiled anxiety he usually associated with anything in his life going unexpectedly. He felt, and he examined this carefully. The way he examined a load calculation, he wasn't quite sure about something more like the strange quiet that comes after a storm. Like the snow outside, like the particular stillness of a world that has been transformed overnight and hasn't decided what to make of itself yet. There was something else, too. Smaller and harder to name. A faint ache. The kind that lives at the border between loss and something that hasn't been decided yet. Because the truth was that in 18 months of getting through his days, through the job site mornings and the school drop-offs and the evenings when Wren was asleep and the apartment was quiet in a way that had no bottom, he had not had a single conversation like the one he apparently couldn't remember. He hadn't talked about Allison Wren's mother to anyone outside of family in those 18 months. His crew were good men, loyal men. But grief was not the vocabulary of a job site at 7 in the morning. Mrs. Figueroa next door made him food sometimes, which was its own kind of language, but it wasn't this. He'd kept the talking in a room and locked the door, and he visited it alone, and it had become such a habit of solitude that he'd stopped noticing what it cost him. 40 minutes. He'd apparently talked about Wren for 40 minutes, to a woman whose name he hadn't known. And she had listened, really listened, not the performative half-attention that people offered when they didn't know what to do with someone else's grief, and he couldn't even fully access the memory of it, which felt like a particular kind of irony. He looked at the business card on the kitchen counter. She must have left it quietly, sometime between Wren's knock and the front door closing. It was heavy stock, cream-colored, minimal. Sable Merritt, CEO, Hartwell Development Group, a phone number, an email address, nothing else. He turned it over, blank on the back. He thought about her shoes, placed parallel at the foot of the bed with their precise, small neatness. He thought about the way she'd looked at his apartment, the library books, the framed photo, the work boots with the focused, neutral attention of someone who was reading something rather than judging it. He thought about the one sentence she had volunteered about herself, at the bar, before he'd started talking, and apparently not stopped. I run a company. 3 words that could have been an entire conversation, and instead she'd used them as a door she didn't need to walk through. Content to stay on his side of the room instead. Dad, Wren said, without looking up from her drawing. Who was the lady? He looked at his daughter. A friend, he said. She has good shoes, Wren said, with the authority of someone who had opinions about shoes. They were very tall. Yes, he agreed. They were. Wren looked up at him then, briefly, with the particular brown eyes she'd inherited from Allison Direct. Assessing, already seeing more than she was supposed to. Then she nodded, satisfied, and returned to Chancellor. The horse had 6 legs today, and an expression of tremendous dignity. Callum picked up the business card and put it in the drawer, where he kept the things he didn't want to lose. The week that followed was cold in a way that was strictly logistical. The Meridian Tower contract was done, and Hartwell had 2 other projects in pre-development that his crew was slated to crew. But neither had broken ground yet. He was filling time with a smaller residential job on the north side, a foundation replacement, tedious work, the kind that didn't require him to think very hard. He did not contact Sable Merritt. This was not avoidance exactly. Or not entirely. It was more that he couldn't find a frame for it. Couldn't identify what kind of contact it would be. What it was reaching for. Thank you for preventing me from freezing to death seemed insufficient. I enjoyed talking to you seemed presumptuous. The business card sat in the drawer, and he occasionally thought about it, the way you think about a door you haven't decided whether to open. On Thursday, Marcus Fletcher came by the North Side job. Fletcher was the kind of project manager who made every interaction feel like a negotiation, even when he was ostensibly just checking in. He was about 50, with the permanent tan of a man who took a lot of golf vacations, and he had a way of saying things sideways, nothing direct, nothing you could point to, but with a consistent undertone that made Callum's jaw tighten. "Heard you had an interesting night last week," Fletcher said, standing at the edge of the foundation trench, with his hands in his jacket pockets. Callum kept his eyes on the work, not particularly. Laney's bar. Fletcher's voice was casual. Too casual. Some of the guys were talking. "My guys don't gossip," I said. "Some of the guys." A pause. "You know how it is. People see things. Word gets around." Another pause. "Designed. Especially when what they see involves someone from the executive floor." Callum looked at him then, directly. Fletcher met his gaze with a mild expression that could have been curiosity or warning or both. "Not sure what you're referencing," Callum said. "I'm sure you're not." Fletcher smiled briefly. "Just saying optics matter on a job site. The Clover Street project is a significant contract. Board-level visibility. People are watching how things are run." He looked out at the trench as though he found it extremely interesting. Wouldn't want any personal entanglements complicating a professional relationship. He left shortly after. Callum watched him go and felt the precise, cold weight of a threat that had been made in the shape of advice. Darnell appeared at his shoulder. He'd been 40 feet away the whole time, moving rebar, and he'd managed to hear all of it anyway because Darnell had always had that quality. "He's nervous about something," Darnell said. "Yes," Callum agreed. "Nervous people are dangerous." "Also yes." Darnell handed him a water bottle. "You should probably figure out what he's nervous about." The accident had happened in November, 4 weeks before the Meridian contract finished. One of his crew, a second-year apprentice named Brett Holloway, had caught a steel edge on the 14th floor. Opened a 6-inch gash along his right forearm. Not life-threatening, but serious enough for an ER visit and 4 weeks of modified duty and a workers' comp claim that had been sitting with the insurance coordinator since Thanksgiving. These things took time. Callum knew that. He'd filled out the incident report the same night, had walked the coordinator through the documentation twice, had done everything correctly. He'd been told it could take 60 to 90 days. The approval came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks early. He noticed because he noticed everything about his crew. It was the kind of attention his father had taught him, and his foreman years had reinforced. He noticed because Brett had mentioned the claim at coffee twice, trying not to make it a complaint, and Callum had been quietly carrying the guilt of the delayed timeline. He opened the email. Copied on the approval was Sable Merritt. He read it twice. The standard insurance claim, approval. Routed normally through HR, but with the CEO's address in the CC line. Which was not standard. Which was, in fact, wildly unusual for a routine workers' comp case on a mid-tier project. She had not made it obvious. She had not sent him a message. Had not flagged it. Had not done anything that could be pointed to as intervention. But she had made sure in a way that left no doubt if you were paying attention that Brett Holloway's check had moved. He sat with that for a long time. He took Wren to the pediatric clinic on a Saturday in late January for her 6-month check and a booster shot that she had been treating with appropriate gravity for approximately 10 days. The Riverside Pediatric Clinic was on the 3rd floor of the same medical complex where Allison had spent the last 4 months of her life, which meant that Callum always experienced these visits with a doubled awareness, the present and the past, layered over each other, incompletely separated. He knew the parking garage, the elevator buttons, the way the fluorescent lighting made everyone look slightly exhausted. He knew the smell of the place. Wren handled the shot with extraordinary composure and was rewarded with 2 stickers and his solemn promise that she could pick dinner. He was signing them out at the front desk when the clinic coordinator, an older woman named Miriam, who had known Allison, said, somewhat tentatively, "Oh, Mr. Dre, I've been meaning to. We found something during the reorganization last month. From the adult care floor. Your wife's file was transferred down here when we consolidated records. And there was a letter with it. That you'd left. From when she was still." She paused. "From a while ago. I wasn't sure if you'd want it." He told her he would take it. He sat in the car while Ren looked at her stickers, and he opened the envelope. He didn't remember writing it. He had written many letters during those months to Allison. To her doctors, to the universe in general. Most of them unsent, and his memory of that period had the grainy, overexposed quality of something shot in too much grief. But when he unfolded the page and read his own handwriting, he recognized it. A letter meant for the room next to Allison's, a room where a different patient had been someone in the ICU, someone whose family had not been there, and he had heard through the wall at 2 in the morning what sounded like a person trying very hard not to fall apart. He had slid the letter under the door. It had been a stupid thing to do. Probably. He had not signed it. He had written about the water stain on the ceiling, shaped like Michigan, and about how he had been staring at it for 3 weeks, and had recently decided it looked more like a bird in flight than a state, and how sometimes the only thing you could do was renegotiate what you were looking at. It was not a profound letter. It was the letter of a very tired man, with nothing particular to offer, except the fact of his own continued presence. He looked at it in the cold car, Ren beside him narrating the stickers' names and occupations. And then slowly, the way understanding arrives when it has been waiting for you, he thought about the ICU on the 4th floor. He thought about the room next door. He thought about a woman who had been in an accident. He thought about dark eyes and absolute stillness. And the way she had listened like someone who understood what it was to be heard through a wall in the middle of the night. He called the number on the business card on a Wednesday afternoon, standing in the parking lot of the Northside job, because he had decided that the way to do this was directly. He had stood with the phone in his hand for about 2 minutes first, not out of hesitation exactly. He knew what he was going to say, but because there was something in the act of standing very still in a cold parking lot with a decision you'd already made, taking one last look at the moment before it changed. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Dre," she said. "No surprise, no performance. How did you know it was me?" "I saved the number. A beat. I've been waiting to see if you'd call." He exhaled. "I need to ask you something." "I know." He hadn't expected that. He was quiet for a moment. "You were on the 4th floor. Riverside Medical. January 2022. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something being confirmed rather than revealed. "Yes," she said. "The car accident. Head-on collision on the westbound interchange. I was in the ICU for 11 days. Her voice was entirely steady. "The first 4, they weren't sure about the extent of the neurological impact. I had a lot of time to think about ceilings." Something tightened in his throat. He met her the following afternoon in her office, on the 22nd floor of the Hartwell building, which was a room designed for precision and clarity, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the river, a desk that looked like it had been engineered rather than purchased, very little that was personal. She was standing when he came in, which he appreciated. It felt like something other than a meeting. She was wearing charcoal gray. Her hair was pulled back. She looked, in this context, entirely like a CEO-like power-made architectural and also, somehow, like the woman who had read a printed report at a bar in a snowstorm, which were two things he was still trying to reconcile. He had spent the previous evening trying to reconstruct what he knew about those 11 days in January of 2022. They were not easy days to reconstruct. Allison had been in her 3rd month of a treatment protocol that was, at that point, still considered promising. He'd been working 7-day weeks because the work was the only thing that fully occupied his mind, and the remaining hours he'd given to her, and to Ren, and to the specific labor of not falling apart in front of either of them. The nights he'd spent at the hospital had been their own separate country, the fluorescent corridors, the particular silence of 4 in the morning. The way time moved differently in a medical building, more slowly, and more honestly. He remembered the sound from the adjacent room. Not words, just the particular quality of someone trying to hold themselves together, in a space that offered very little privacy for falling apart. He'd slid the letter under the door without turning on the light, without looking to see whether it was received. Then he'd gone back to Allison's room and sat in the chair by her bed and looked at the ceiling until morning. "I kept the letter," Sable said, before he could begin. She said it simply, like something she'd decided he was owed. "I read it 11 days in the ICU. And then when I got home, I put it in the drawer of the first nightstand I bought for the first apartment I could afford when I was 24, because that's where I kept things I didn't want to lose." A pause. "I've read it probably 20 times. He stood in the middle of her office and had no response that felt adequate. "You didn't sign it," she said. "I didn't know who would read it." "No." She looked at him. "You just knew someone needed to hear it." He thought about that. He thought about how little it had felt like a decision at the time, more like the only available action, which was different. He'd had nothing to offer except the fact of his own presence in the same building, surviving the same sleepless hours. The letter had been his way of saying, "You're not as alone as this room makes you feel." He hadn't known if it would mean anything. He hadn't expected to be in a position to know. She moved to the window and looked at the river, which was partially frozen and moving slowly, with the reluctant persistence of something that intends to complete its journey regardless of conditions. "I was alone in the hospital," she said. Not with self-pity, just as a fact, laid flat. "I don't have family nearby. I'd told my assistant not to contact anyone from the company. I had very specific reasons for wanting to handle it privately." She paused. "By day 3, I was beginning to understand what the word alone actually meant. Not the professional version of it, which I was very comfortable with. The other kind, the night kind," he said. She turned from the window. "Yes, exactly that. The letter was a stupid thing to do," he said. "I knew that when I did it. I didn't know anything about the person in that room. No." She looked at him with that steady, measuring attention he'd been getting better at reading. "You knew someone was in that room at 2 in the morning and sounded like they were in pain. That was enough for you." A pause. "That's not nothing, Mr. Dre." He thought about Ren, asleep 3 rooms away from Allison in those final weeks, growing up into a world that was quietly being reconfigured around her. He thought about the letters he'd written to the universe in general, that he'd never sent. He thought about the one that had somehow found its recipient anyway, slid under a door in the dark, and had been read 20 times in a nightstand drawer he'd never seen. "The night at the bar," he said. "Did you recognize me?" "Not at first." She moved to the window, looked out at the river. "I recognized something, a quality. I couldn't place it. Then you mentioned the water stain that looked like Michigan, and I." She paused. "I knew. Why didn't you say so?" She turned from the window. Her expression was not unreadable. He was getting better at reading it. He realized, but it was careful. Like a person choosing where to step on uncertain ground. "Because I wasn't sure what it would mean to say it." She paused. "And because it was the first conversation I'd had in 3 years, where someone talked to me, and not to my title, I didn't want to end it." He understood that, precisely. He understood it with the part of himself that had kept the door to a particular room locked for 18 months, not because he was afraid of what was in it, but because the act of opening it in front of the wrong person would have cost something he couldn't afford to lose. "Thank you," he said, finally, "for the letter that you wrote back." She looked at him. Something shifted in the careful architecture of her face. "You knew? I found it in Allison's file. Her medical records, from when they were consolidated. There was a letter I'd written returned to the wrong room, probably, or misfiled." He paused, and there was a note with it. 2 sentences. She was very still. He had memorized them, the 2 sentences, in the cold car with Ren beside him naming her stickers. "The ceiling in my room is a map. I'm still deciding where it leads. You signed it," he said, "just a first name. I didn't know anything about the person next door either," she said quietly. I knew someone had been kind to me at 2 in the morning for no reason they'd ever be able to explain. That was enough. Outside the 22nd floor windows, the river moved under its ice, with the slow patience of something that has always known where it's going. Darnell found the discrepancy on a Friday morning, which was not how Callum had expected his Friday to begin. The Clover Street project, the large residential and commercial development that was Hartwell's biggest current contract and the one Fletcher managed directly, had a material procurement log that didn't balance. Darnell had been doing a routine equipment audit for the North Side job and had accidentally received a misfiled spreadsheet. He had looked at it because Darnell looked at everything. The concrete specified in the structural drawings is Type 3 high early strength, Darnell said, spreading the printed pages across the hood of the truck. The delivery receipts show Type 2 standard for 6 of the foundation pours. Callum looked at the numbers. That's a substitution, without notation, without any amended spec. Which means either someone ordered wrong, or someone ordered wrong on purpose and submitted the costs for the right material. Callum straightened. The cold was significant. He didn't notice it. How much of a difference in unit cost? About $12 per cubic yard. On the volume they poured? Darnell's mouth was flat. Call it $40,000. $40,000. Not a number that would topple a company. But a number that, if it became a pattern and discrepancies like this were rarely solitary, could indicate something much larger. He thought about Fletcher. About the way he'd said optics matter. About the careful, sideways nature of a threat that had been dressed as advice. Fletcher had been nervous about something. Now Callum knew what. I need you to hold on to those documents, he said. Darnell picked up the pages and folded them with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood what he was holding. Callum took out his phone. He called the number he'd saved under SM, and she answered on the second ring, and he said, I need to show you something. The internal audit was quiet and surgical, the way Sable apparently preferred to operate. She received the documents that evening. Callum left them with her assistant on the 22nd floor, which felt both absurdly formal and exactly right, and by the following morning, she'd put 2 members of her finance team on the procurement records going back 18 months. What they found in 6 days was worse than $40,000. It was a pattern, spanning 4 projects, involving substituted materials, falsified delivery certifications, and a side arrangement between Fletcher and a supplier that had cost Hartwell somewhere in the range of $380,000 over 2 years. Callum knew the timeline because Sable told him, in brief, factual messages delivered at odd hours, 6 in the morning, 11 at night, that had the quality of someone thinking out loud to the only person they trusted with the thinking. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd started to look forward to them. The board meeting was on a Thursday. He knew about it because Sable mentioned it once, briefly. Board's been told about the audit findings. Meeting Thursday to determine next steps. And then, after a pause, Fletcher will be there. He's been telling them the audit is a distraction. That the real governance issue is my personal conduct. Callum understood then what Fletcher had been building. The conversation about optics. The suggestions about personal entanglements. Fletcher had been constructing a narrative in advance, something to pivot to if the financial discrepancy came to light. Yes, but what about the CEO and the site foreman? What do you want me to do? He said, when she told him. Nothing, she said immediately. This is my board. My problem. You didn't make it a problem alone. A pause. No, she said. But I'll finish it that way. That's how it has to work. He didn't argue. He understood the logic of it, understood that her authority depended on exactly this, on being the person who handled her own battles. That was not a thing he was going to take from her. Thursday, he was on the North Side job from 7 in the morning. Doing what he did, which was the labor of making things plumb and true and correctly anchored to the ground. Darnell worked beside him and said nothing about the meeting, for which Callum was grateful. At 2:14 in the afternoon, his phone lit up with a message from an unsaved number he recognized as her assistant's. Vote was 5-1. He put the phone back in his pocket. He kept working. He didn't say anything for about 10 minutes, and then Darnell, who had been watching him the way Darnell watched things, said, "Good news or bad news?" "Good news," Callum said. Darnell nodded once. "Okay then." He went to the Hartwell building at 4 o'clock, which was not something he had planned to do. He went because the message had come, and he'd finished the day's work, and he'd thought about going home and sitting with the information alone, and instead, he found himself in the parking garage of the Hartwell building, without a fully formed account of how he'd gotten there. He'd told Darnell at 3 that he was leaving early. Darnell had looked at him with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific piece of information, and said, "Yeah." Okay, without any elaboration, which was the fullest possible endorsement Darnell was capable of offering. The lobby was the kind of lobby that announces money without being vulgar about it. High ceilings, white stone floors, the particular hush of a space that has been engineered for a specific impression. The afternoon light came through the tall windows at a low winter angle, spreading across the floor in long, pale parallelograms. He stood in the middle of it for a moment, aware of how he looked. Work jacket, steel toes, a person who had spent the day in single-digit temperatures, doing things with his hands in a lobby, designed to receive people whose work left different marks. He told the front desk his name. He said he was there to see Miss Merritt. He was prepared to be told to schedule an appointment. "She said to send you up," the woman behind the desk said. Without consulting anyone, he rode the elevator to the 22nd floor, and the doors opened onto the executive corridor, and Sable was already walking toward him from the far end of the hall. She was still in what she'd worn to the board meeting. He assumed a dark jacket, fitted, professional, and her hair was still pulled back, but there was something in the way she was carrying herself that was different from the composed, self-contained stillness he'd come to expect. She looked, he thought, like a person who had just finished doing something very hard and was still taking stock of whether they were intact. She looked the way he'd looked in the parking lot of the hospital the day after Allison had been diagnosed, standing in the cold with his hands in his pockets, not ready to start the car yet. Not broken, exactly. Not even close to broken. Just needing a moment to confirm that the ground was still there. They met in the middle of the corridor, which felt somehow appropriate. 5-1, he said. 5-1. She looked at him. Fletcher tendered his resignation before the vote concluded. What about the financial findings? Being referred to outside counsel and the applicable regulatory bodies. A pause. It will be a process. But it will happen correctly, he nodded. There was something satisfying about that. Not the vindication of it. Not the justice of it exactly, but the correctness of it. The sense that load-bearing elements had been identified and addressed, and the structure would hold. It was a foreman's satisfaction, probably, but it was what he had. The light in the corridor was the same flat winter light as everywhere else in the city at 4 in January, and it made everything look very clear, and a little austere and completely honest, which he found he preferred to anything warmer that might let you see less. He looked at her. She looked like herself, in this light. Whatever that was, and he was still assembling his understanding of it, would probably be assembling it for a long time. She looked like the truest version of it. Not the CEO alone, not the woman in the bar, not the patient in a room trying not to fall apart, not the person who had placed her shoes in parallel at the foot of his bed and slept in his flannel shirt with the frayed cuff. All of it at once. He was aware that he'd come here without knowing what he was going to say, and that this was turning out to be fine. "Ren wants you to come see the snow fort," he said. He hadn't planned to say that either. He seemed to be having a day characterized by a notable lack of planning, which was unusual for him, and which he was, to his own mild surprise, not particularly concerned about. Something moved through Sable's face. Not the controlled, professional non-expression he'd learned to read for the things that existed under it. This was something that broke through, that something unguarded and a little surprised, and, underneath both of those, something that looked very much like the specific relief of a person who has been waiting for the right thing to be said and had not let themselves know they were waiting. She didn't smile immediately. It came the way real things come slowly, from the inside, without any announcement. Something in her expression shifted, like a window opening onto a room that had been kept closed. He thought he understood something about how she had learned to hold herself, the precision of it, the self-sufficiency, the controlled stillness that could be mistaken for coldness, but was something more like caution. The caution of a person who had been alone in a hospital room at 2 in the morning and had learned to make herself very sufficient so that she would never need to be in that position again. He also thought he understood something about what it meant that she was smiling at him anyway. "Chancellor needs a stable," she said. "Architecturally speaking, that's a significant undertaking for a 6-year-old. She has high standards. She sounds like someone worth knowing." A pause. Both of them do. Outside the windows of the 22nd floor, the river was silver under the afternoon sky, and the snow that had been falling off and on for 3 weeks was, for the first time in what felt like a very long while, simply still. The city was covered in it, clean and quiet and new-looking. The way things only look after a storm has finally exhausted itself when the work of transformation is done and what's left is simply the world but rearranged, waiting to see what people will build in it. He thought about the water stain, shaped like Michigan. He thought about a letter slid under a hospital door at 2 in the morning, written without expectation of response, without signature, offered because someone had needed to be heard, and he had been present and had chosen, in the small and particular way that was available to him, to try. He thought about 2 sentences written back the ceiling in my room, is a map. I'm still deciding where it leads, carried in a file for 3 years, neither of them knowing. He thought about what it meant to build something, the specific physics of it, the way a structure's integrity is not located in any one beam or bolt but in the relationship between all of them, the way it distributes its load not by concentration but by sharing, the way the whole becomes capable of bearing more than the sum of its parts because of the intelligence of the connections. "My crew finishes the North Side Foundation next week," he said. "After that, I imagine there's some paperwork to go over. For the Clover Street transition, there is," she said, "quite a lot of it. Then I'll be around." She looked at him. He looked at her. In the pale, honest light of a January afternoon, after everything that had been found and followed and brought to the surface, they looked at each other the way 2 people look at each other when they have already, in all the ways that matter, found what they were looking for and are simply deciding, together, to admit it. "Yes," said Sable Merritt. And for the 3rd time in his life, Callum Dre heard a